The policeman felt his impunity in attacking a helpless elderly woman. Passers-by looked away, no one intervened, but suddenly a man appeared, before whom even the most brutal criminals freeze in fear. Subscribe, watch other videos, and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The city pulsed with restless energy as the night stretched on. Neon lights flickered against the wet pavement, their reflections broken by the hurried steps of pedestrians weaving through the crowd. The low hum of distant traffic merged with the occasional honk of a horn, and somewhere in the maze of towering buildings a siren wailed. Life moved at an unrelenting pace, indifferent to the individuals that filled its streets. Among them was Marta. She maneuvered her wheelchair along the uneven sidewalk, her frail hands gripping the wheels tightly as she navigated the familiar path toward the bus stop. A thin drizzle had dampened the city earlier, leaving a slick sheen on the concrete. The tires of her wheelchair left faint tracks in the moisture, a subtle imprint quickly erased by the ceaseless movement around her. She had spent the evening at the small grocery store a few blocks away, carefully selecting just enough food to last her the week: bread, milk, a few apples. Nothing more, nothing extravagant. It had been years since she could afford luxuries. Her life was a quiet one, marked by routine. Every evening, she took this same path, waited at the same bus stop, and returned to the small apartment where she lived alone. Most of the people who saw her regularly never acknowledged her presence, and she had grown used to being invisible. It was easier that way. It spared her the pity, the awkward glances of discomfort from those who did not know what to say to a woman like her, old, alone, confined to a chair. Tonight, however, there was something different in the air, a feeling she couldn't quite place. She had first noticed it a few streets back, a strange awareness that prickled at the edges of her senses, as if unseen eyes lingered on her. The crowd moved as usual, faces blending into the blur of urban existence, but the sensation remained. She told herself it was nothing, just the exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. Yet, as she rolled forward, her heart beat a little faster, her grip on the wheels tightening involuntarily. She approached the crosswalk, waiting for the signal to change. The rain had left behind shallow puddles that reflected the glow of the city, stretching distorted images of neon signs across the asphalt. The night was alive, but in a way that felt distant, disconnected from her small place within it. Then she saw him. Standing just beyond the glow of a flickering street lamp was a man in uniform. His stance was relaxed, hands resting on his utility belt, the bulk of his police-issued gear visible beneath the damp fabric of his dark blue jacket. His face was set in an expression of casual observation, yet there was something unsettling about the way his gaze lingered on her. He was not watching the crowd. He was watching her. Marta knew who he was before she even had to think about it. Officer Randolph. His name carried weight in these streets, though not for reasons any police officer should be proud of. His reputation trailed behind him like a dark stain, whispered about in hushed tones among those who had crossed his path. Stories of his brutality, his abuse of power, circulated within the community, though none had ever reached a courtroom. He was untouchable, shielded by his badge, by the silence of those too afraid to speak against him. He did as he pleased, and the city let him. Now he was looking at her. She forced herself to remain calm, though her breath came a little shorter. Perhaps it was a coincidence. Perhaps he was just standing there, surveying the street like any other officer on patrol. But as the crosswalk light flickered to green and she wheeled forward, She saw him push away from the lamp post, his boots scraping against the damp concrete. He was moving toward her. A jolt of fear tightened in her chest, but she didn't allow herself to hesitate. She kept rolling, kept her gaze ahead, pretending not to notice. There was no reason for him to stop her. She had done nothing wrong. Yet the small voice in the back of her mind whispered that none of that mattered. It never had with men like him. Her destination was only a block away. If she could just reach the bus stop, blend into the small gathering of people waiting there, maybe he would lose interest. She adjusted her grip, pushing harder against the wheels. The cold night air stung her face, but she ignored it, focusing only on the rhythm of her movement. Then, just as she neared the corner, a shadow fell over her path. Randolph stepped in front of her, blocking her way. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. He smiled, not a warm smile, not a polite one. It was the kind of smile a predator wore before it struck. The city moved around them as if nothing was happening. People passed by, their faces turned toward their own lives, their own distractions. None of them stopped. None of them noticed. Randolph did not speak immediately. He simply stood there, towering over her, letting the weight of his presence settle between them. The lights of the city cast harsh shadows across his face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw, cold amusement in his eyes. Marta swallowed hard, gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. Something inside her told her that tonight she would not be invisible. Marta's hands tightened around the arms of her wheelchair as Officer Randolph stood before her, his body blocking her path with casual authority. The street around them remained unchanged. Cars sped past, neon signs flickered, pedestrians moved without concern. But, for Marta, the world had narrowed to the figure looming over her. The damp air suddenly felt heavier, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral, though her heart pounded in her ribs. Maybe, if she didn't react, if she simply waited, he would step aside and let her pass. Maybe this was nothing. A coincidence. A mistake. Randolph didn't move. The longer the silence stretched between them, the more suffocating it became. The sharp scent of rain-soaked concrete mixed with the distant aroma of street food. But beneath it all, Marta could sense something else, something intangible yet undeniable. The weight of being watched, being scrutinized. Then he leaned in slightly, his shadow stretching over her like a creeping vine. The expression on his face didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something Marta had seen before in men who knew they held all the power. Her pulse quickened. She had spent a lifetime learning how to read people, how to measure the dangers in small gestures, in flickers of movement. She knew when a situation had turned, when it had shifted from an uncomfortable encounter to something worse. And now, as she sat trapped in her chair, pinned beneath the weight of his presence, she knew. Randolph spoke, but she barely heard the words. It wasn't what he was saying. It was the way he said it. Slow, measured, amused, the kind of voice that expected no resistance. She tried to move past him, but his boot slid forward, pressing lightly against the front wheel of her chair, halting her attempt. A sickening awareness coiled in her stomach. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a coincidence. He had chosen her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she swallowed hard, willing herself not to show fear. If she gave him nothing, maybe he would lose interest. Maybe he would let her go. Randolph smirked, as if reading her thoughts, and then, without warning, his hand shot forward. He grabbed the back of her wheelchair and shoved. Marta gasped as the sudden force jerked her backward. The world tilted violently, her vision spinning as she felt the chair lurch off balance. The contents of her grocery bag spilled onto the ground, apples rolling into the gutter, the loaf of bread landing in a puddle. She barely managed to keep herself upright, her hands clutching at the chair's armrests as she struggled to regain control. But Randolph wasn't finished. Before she could react, he stepped closer, pressing his boot against the base of the wheelchair again. This time, harder. She wasn't just being pushed, she was being trapped. The realization struck like ice in her veins. She looked up, her breath shallow, searching the faces of the passing crowd. No one stopped. A few people glanced in their direction, eyes flicking over the scene before quickly turning away. A man in a suit hesitated for a fraction of a second before tightening his grip on his briefcase and walking faster. A woman with earbuds and barely even noticed. They saw, and they kept moving. Marta's throat constricted as fear tightened its grip. It wasn't just the physical helplessness that terrified her, it was the knowledge that no one would help. Randolph knew it too. That was the worst part. She could see it in the way he carried himself, in the ease with which he leaned in, his face just inches from hers. He enjoyed this. Not just the power, but the certainty that there would be no consequences. She tried to push back, to move, to do anything, but his boot remained firm. Her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to yell, to call for help, but would it even matter? Even if she screamed, even if someone looked, would they step in? Would they risk themselves for a stranger? The answer pressed down on her like a crushing weight. Randolph's hand rested on the back of her chair again, his grip firm, testing. Her breath hitched. And then, in one sharp motion, he shoved her chair backward. This time, she couldn't stop it. Her back slammed against the cold, wet pavement, the impact jolting through her bones. Pain flared in her elbow where it struck the ground, but she barely registered it over the panic surging through her chest. Her wheelchair clattered onto its side, metal scraping against concrete. She was on the ground. The city continued around her, indifferent. Randolph stood over her, his silhouette outlined against the artificial glow of the streetlights. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, but the gleam in his eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't about anger. It wasn't about anything she had done. It was about power. And right now, he had all of it. Marta tried to push herself up, her hands scrambling against the wet pavement. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the distant sounds of the city over it. Randolph shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance. His fingers tapped against the handle of his baton, a lazy, absent-minded motion, as if he had all the time in the world. He wasn't in a hurry, because no one was coming to stop him. Marta's breath came in shallow gasps, her chest tight with terror. She had never felt more helpless. She had never felt more alone. And then, everything changed. The rhythm of the city stuttered. A presence, subtle at first but undeniable, rippled through the air. Randolph felt it before he saw it. His head turned slightly, his body shifting just enough to acknowledge what Marta had already sensed. Someone was watching. Someone had seen. And they were coming. The air around them thickened, charged with an energy Marta couldn't quite explain. It was subtle at first, like the distant roll of thunder before a storm fully arrived. Something had shifted, the balance of the moment tilting just enough to unsettle even Randolph, who had, until now, held complete control over the situation. He felt it, too. She could see it in the slight stiffening of his posture, in the way his fingers stopped their lazy tapping against the baton at his hip. The city had not stopped moving. Cars still rumbled down the street, pedestrians still wove through the sidewalk. But somewhere in the ebb and flow of that motion, something had changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. Marta's breath came in short gasps as she forced herself to shift her gaze past the looming figure of Randolph, scanning the edges of the crowd, searching. And then she saw him. He wasn't running. He wasn't pushing through the bystanders or making any show of urgency. He simply walked, his steps deliberate, measured. The way he moved was effortless, yet there was something about him that made people instinctively step aside, creating a clear path even in the shifting sea of pedestrians. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply, dark jeans, a plain shirt, and a worn denim jacket that looked like it had seen more than its fair share of years. But it wasn't his clothing that held attention. It was him. There was an unspoken authority in his posture, an undeniable presence that was impossible to ignore. He did not scan the street in confusion, did not hesitate as if trying to decide whether or not to intervene. His eyes were locked onto one thing, onto Randolph. And Randolph knew it. A flicker of irritation passed over the officer's face, barely perceptible, but Marta caught it. He turned slightly, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for some inevitable confrontation, though he still wore the thin mask of confidence. But something was different now. The crowd around them, the same crowd that had ignored Marta's struggle only moments before, was beginning to slow. People who had once walked past without a second glance were now pausing, sensing the shift in the air. They didn't know exactly why they had stopped. They didn't understand what was about to happen, but they felt it. Randolph adjusted his stance. His hand rested a little more firmly on the baton at his hip. He was still confident, but no longer careless. The man in the denim jacket stopped just at the edge of the alley where Marta lay sprawled beside her overturned wheelchair. He did not rush forward in concern, did not speak immediately. Instead, he stood still, his gaze never leaving Randolph. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Randolph was the first to break it. He didn't ask the stranger what he wanted. He didn't demand he leave. That would have been too direct. Instead, he gave a slow, dismissive shake of his head and let out a short, dry laugh. It was the kind of laugh a man gives when he doesn't want to admit he's feeling cornered. But the man in the denim jacket did not react. He did not flinch, did not respond, did not acknowledge the attempt to downplay the situation. He simply watched. Randolph exhaled through his nose, his fingers tightening slightly around the baton. Marta felt it then, the shift in power. Randolph had been in control of this moment from the beginning. He had chosen her, had decided how this encounter would play out, had been secure in the knowledge that no one would interfere. But now, someone had. And the weight of that interference was pressing down on him. The stranger took a single step forward. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't a challenge, but it was final. Randolph's smirk faltered just slightly. The neon glow of the streetlights cast sharp angles over both men, illuminating their faces in flickering bursts of red and blue from a nearby storefront sign. Randolph inhaled, slow and measured, as if considering his next move. He wasn't afraid. Not yet. But he was aware now. Marta could see the calculations running through his mind. Could he still walk away from this? Could he assert his dominance without consequence? Could he turn this moment back in his favor? And then, just as quickly as the thoughts formed, Marta saw the answer settle into his stance. Randolph wasn't going to back down. He was going to fight. And he had already lost. The night had gone still. The hum of the city remained, a distant, ever-present murmur of engines, footsteps, and conversations. But within this narrow space between buildings, time had stretched, thickened, waiting. The weight of inevitability hung between the two men, a silent understanding passing between them. Randolph squared his shoulders, shifting his weight slightly, his fingers now fully wrapped around the handle of his baton. His smirk had vanished, replaced by something harder, something less certain. The man in the denim jacket remained motionless, his posture loose, unreadable, but there was no hesitation in the way he stood. He wasn't bracing for a fight. He was waiting to end one. Marta lay motionless on the ground, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew what was coming before Randolph even moved. She had seen enough men like him to know that he would not allow himself to be challenged, not in public, not after the crowd had begun to notice. Even if there was no official authority present yet, he could feel the eyes on him now. The balance of power had shifted, but he would not let it tip without a fight. It happened fast. Randolph moved first, jerking the baton free from his belt in a practiced motion, the metal scraping against its holster with a sharp click. His body twisted as he swung downward in a powerful arc, aiming to strike the man square in the ribs, a move designed to cripple, to take control of the fight immediately. But he hit nothing. The stranger stepped aside at the last moment, shifting smoothly as if he had anticipated the strike before it had even begun. The baton sliced through empty air, and in the fraction of a second it took for Randolph to adjust, the counterattack came. A fist drove into his solar plexus, precise and unrelenting. The impact was brutal, sending a hollow, sickening sound echoing through the alley as Randolph's breath left his lungs in a sharp, stunned gasp. His body jerked forward involuntarily, his knees nearly buckling. But the stranger wasn't done. A second strike followed immediately, this time to the ribs, controlled, deliberate, not wild, not rushed. It landed with surgical precision, a calculated application of force that sent Randolph staggering backward, his boots scuffing against the wet pavement. His grip on the baton loosened for just a moment, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Marta barely breathed. She had seen fights before. Street scuffles, bar brawls, desperate men swinging at each other in anger or self-defense. But this was different. This was not a reckless flurry of fists and adrenaline. This was something measured, something efficient. The man in the denim jacket was not fighting to prove anything. He was fighting to finish this. Randolph snarled, more out of wounded pride than pain. He recovered quickly, too quickly for someone who had just taken 2 direct blows. He was strong, that much was clear. Years of throwing his weight around, of using his size and training to dominate those weaker than him, had made him formidable in his own way. But, for the first time, he wasn't the strongest one here. His next attack was more controlled, more careful. He adjusted his grip on the baton, holding it with both hands now, his stance shifting slightly. He was trying to predict, to counter, to regain control of the moment before it slipped further from his grasp. His muscles tensed as he lunged forward again, this time swinging lower, aiming for the stranger's knee, a move designed to disable an opponent before they could retaliate. It missed. But this time, the stranger didn't just dodge. He stepped into the attack. His hand snapped out, catching Randolph's wrist mid-swing, stopping the baton's momentum dead in its tracks. A heartbeat later, he twisted. The motion was sharp, precise, a maneuver meant to disarm. Randolph grunted, his grip faltering as pain jolted up his arm. The baton clattered to the ground, skidding across the pavement, the sound sharp and final. The shift in power was immediate. Randolph tried to yank his arm free, but the stranger held firm. A second later, he moved again, stepping in closer, using his own body weight to flip Randolph off balance. The officer hit the ground hard. His back slammed against the concrete, the impact sending a shockwave through his frame. His breath left him in a ragged exhale as he lay sprawled across the alley floor, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The stranger stepped over him, looking down with an expression that remained unreadable, calm in a way that sent a different kind of fear crawling up Marta's spine. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't reveling in victory. He was simply done. Randolph groaned, rolling onto his side, his face contorted with pain and fury. His hand twitched toward his belt, toward the gun holstered there. A last, desperate grasp at power, at control. A single, sharp movement cut him off. The stranger's boot came down, not on his hand, but beside it, firm enough to send a warning through the ground beneath them. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement. Don't. Randolph froze. For the first time since the encounter had begun, real fear entered his eyes. Marta exhaled shakily, the adrenaline making her limbs feel weak. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if Randolph would try again, if he would take the humiliation and turn it into something worse later. But she knew one thing. Tonight, for the first time, he had lost. Randolph's heavy breathing filled the alley, ragged and uneven, a sharp contrast to the steady rise and fall of the stranger's chest. The fight had left him winded, stripped of the power he had wielded so effortlessly just moments ago. His fingers twitched against the concrete, curling into a fist as if gripping at the last remnants of control. His uniform, once pristine, was now dirtied, his badge catching the dim glow of the street lamp overhead. His pride had suffered a deeper wound than his body, and that was a pain he was not accustomed to feeling. Marta had not moved. She remained where she had fallen, watching the scene unfold with the stunned awareness of someone who had just narrowly escaped disaster. Her wheelchair lay overturned a few feet away, one of its wheels still spinning lazily in the air, a silent testament to the chaos that had just erupted. The stranger had stepped away from Randolph now, his back turned, his silhouette a stark contrast against the faint glow from the street beyond the alley. He did not gloat, he did not taunt. He simply left, as if what had just transpired required no further action. And maybe, for him, it didn't. Randolph, however, was not done. A low growl of frustration rumbled from his chest as he pushed himself up, his limbs trembling slightly from the strain of the blows he had taken. His face twisted with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck stood out against his skin. He was not used to losing. He was not used to being on the receiving end of the kind of violence he so often inflicted. Marta saw the moment his mind shifted, the moment survival turned to revenge. His hand moved toward his belt, fingers grazing the holster at his side. Even in his weakened state, even with the weight of defeat pressing down on him, he was still a man with a weapon. But the stranger had not left yet. The moment Randolph reached for his gun, the man in the denim jacket turned. His movement was unhurried, controlled, but his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, locked onto Randolph with an intensity that froze the officer in place. It was not fear that stopped him. It was the undeniable certainty that if he continued, the consequences would be swift and absolute. Randolph's fingers hesitated just above the holster, trembling with indecision. His breath came fast, sharp, his rage battling against something more primal, an instinct that told him he was no longer in control of this situation. The stranger took a single step forward. That was all it took. Randolph's hand dropped away from his belt, his lips curling in frustration. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to reclaim the dominance he had lost, but some part of him, some deep, animalistic part, understood that he had already lost. There was no salvaging this. Not now. A murmur stirred at the entrance of the alley. The crowd that had once ignored the unfolding scene had begun to change. Eyes that had previously averted were now fixed on the aftermath, drawn by something undeniable. Phones were out, cameras recording, the glow of their screens capturing evidence that would not be buried. Marta felt her heartbeat quicken. For the first time, the city saw. Randolph must have felt it too. He turned his head slightly, his gaze darkening toward the figures gathering at the edges of the alley. Some stood in quiet disbelief, others murmured among themselves, but none of them moved to intervene. Not because they were afraid, but because they had already chosen a side. And it was not his. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Realization, perhaps, or the bitter taste of inevitability. Then came the sound. Distant at first, barely a murmur against the city's constant hum, but then it grew. Sharp, distinct. Sirens. Randolph's expression darkened. His body tensed as he looked toward the street, toward the approaching blue and red lights that reflected off the wet pavement. The approaching reality of what had just happened settled over him, and for the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Marta could hardly believe it. He was going to be held accountable. The stranger remained still, watching, but making no move to stay. He had done what needed to be done. His presence had shifted the tides, had tilted the balance away from men like Randolph and toward something closer to justice. But he had no intention of waiting to see how it ended. He turned again, this time with finality, and walked toward the mouth of the alley. His steps were as steady as they had been when he arrived, unaffected by the weight of what had just transpired. He was leaving. Randolph saw it too, and for a brief moment, something desperate flickered in his expression. He wanted to call out, to demand something, but no words came. There was nothing left to say, nothing he could do to undo what had already been set in motion. The crowd parted as the stranger stepped onto the sidewalk, blending into the city as seamlessly as he had emerged from it. He was gone. Marta barely had time to process it before the police arrived. The cruisers skidded to a halt at the curb, doors bursting open as uniformed officers spilled into the street. Their radios crackled, hands hovering near their holsters, ready for anything. But what they found was not a riot, not chaos. They found their own. Randolph, bloodied and on the ground, his reputation shattered in the cold light of the street lamps. The scattered pieces of his authority lay around him, unseen but undeniable. One of the officers stepped forward, glancing between Randolph and the gathering crowd. Then toward Marta, who still sat against the wall, shaken but alive. "What happened here?" The words came, but no one answered immediately. Not because they didn't know, but because they wanted it to be said aloud. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice rang out. "He attacked her." Another followed. "He shoved her to the ground." The murmurs swelled, a chorus of voices overlapping, each one a witness, each one a thread in the unraveling of Randolph's carefully protected power. The officer's gaze hardened. He turned toward Randolph, who had pushed himself upright but said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. The evidence was overwhelming. The weight of the crowd was against him. "Check the security footage," The officer ordered one of his subordinates. "I want to see everything." Randolph flinched. He knew what they would find. He knew there would be no rewriting this story, no twisting it into something that fit his version of events. Justice was not blind tonight. Marta inhaled deeply, the air sharp in her lungs. She was safe. But more than that, for the first time in a long time, the city did not feel quite so indifferent. The street was awash in flashing blue and red, the rhythmic pulse of sirens reflecting off the wet pavement like ghostly warnings. The hum of the city, which had for a time faded into the background, surged back to life in the form of murmuring voices, the crackle of police radios, and the distant honking of impatient drivers forced to reroute. The air smelled of exhaust and damp concrete, mingling with the electric tension still hanging over the scene. Marta sat on the curb, her body still trembling from the adrenaline that had yet to fade. She pressed a palm to her stomach, grounding herself, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath. She had survived. She had been spared. But more than that, something had changed. Something in the air, something in the way the city had reacted, or rather, finally chosen not to look away. The crowd had grown since the fight ended, drawn in by the spectacle, by the presence of uniformed officers surrounding one of their own. Randolph was still on the ground, his hands pressed against his knees, his face contorted in pain and anger. His uniform was rumpled, his dignity shattered, his illusion of invincibility stripped away under the unblinking gaze of cameras and witnesses. He had been untouchable once, a name spoken in warning, a figure feared but never challenged. But tonight, the city had finally seen him fall. Marta turned her head, searching for the man who had saved her, the man in the denim jacket, the stranger who had stepped into the darkness and pulled her back into the light. But he was gone. Not a trace of him remained. It was as if he had never been there at all. She wasn't the only one looking. Some in the crowd glanced around, their eyes darting through the shifting bodies, scanning the street, the alleys, the doorways. The officers, too, cast quick glances toward the sidewalks, their brows furrowed as if expecting to find him standing nearby, watching. But there was nothing. He had vanished into the city, swallowed by the very streets from which he had emerged. The realization left Marta with a strange sense of emptiness, a hollow awareness that she had witnessed something rare, something fleeting. The man who had fought for her, who had faced Randolph without fear, had not waited for thanks. He had not lingered for recognition or validation. He had simply done what needed to be done. A firm voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Miss, are you all right?" She turned to find one of the officers crouched beside her, his expression serious but not unkind. His badge gleamed under the flashing lights, the reflection catching the hard lines of his face. Marta opened her mouth to respond, but her throat was dry, her voice lost somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. She swallowed, forcing herself to focus, to find her words. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I think so." The officer nodded, glancing down at the way she cradled her stomach. His gaze softened just slightly. "We're going to have paramedics check you out, just to be safe." Marta barely had the energy to nod, her body still locked in the remnants of fear, but she accepted his words without protest. Across the street, another officer stood with Randolph, speaking in clipped, hushed tones. It was clear that no amount of rank would protect him now. The weight of what had happened was too much, too public. The footage, the witnesses, the undeniable truth that had unfolded under the flickering glow of street lamps had left no room for manipulation. Randolph's career was over. And yet, even in his defeated state, Marta saw the way his hands clenched, the way his jaw tightened with barely restrained fury. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't ashamed. He was simply enraged that, for the first time, he had been stopped. She turned away, unwilling to let him steal another second of her thoughts. The paramedics arrived, moving through the crowd with quiet efficiency. One of them, a woman with warm brown eyes and a steady voice, knelt beside Marta and gently took her wrist, checking her pulse. "Do you feel any sharp pain?" she asked, her tone calm, professional. Marta shook her head. "No, just shaken." The paramedic nodded in understanding, her hands moving to examine her elbow where the worst of the impact had landed. There was a deep scrape, darkened with dirt and dried blood, but nothing appeared broken. "You're lucky," the paramedic said softly. "It could have been much worse." Marta knew that. She had seen how close she had come to something far more terrible. The paramedic finished her assessment, giving her a reassuring nod. "We'll clean this up, but if you feel any dizziness or pain later, make sure you see a doctor, and if anything feels wrong with the baby, don't wait to get checked out." Marta placed a hand over her stomach again, feeling the steady warmth beneath her fingertips. "I will," she promised. The crowd had begun to thin, the initial shock of the scene fading into the ordinary hum of the city. People had recorded what they needed, whispered what they had seen, and now, slowly, they were moving on. But as they left, they carried something with them. A story. One they would tell again and again. A story about a cop who had abused his power and had finally faced justice. A story about a man who had appeared out of nowhere, who had fought without hesitation, who had disappeared without a word. And that was how it would spread. Not just as another piece of urban legend, but as something real. A reminder that even in the depths of the city, where corruption thrived and fear silenced those who wished to speak, there were still those who would not stand by, those who would act, those who would not wait for permission to do what was right. Marta watched as Randolph was finally led toward one of the police cruisers. His face was pale with barely restrained rage, but there was nothing he could do. The weight of the night pressed down on him, on the choices he had made, on the consequences he had never thought he would face. She turned away before they closed the door behind him. The officer from before returned to her side, his expression unreadable. "Do you know who that man was?" Marta hesitated. She didn't know his name. She had never seen him before tonight, and yet she felt certain that she had always known his kind. "No," she said finally, "but I don't think that matters." The officer studied her for a moment, then nodded. It was an answer that felt more truthful than any name could have been. As she was helped to her feet, she cast one last glance towards the street, half expecting to see him standing there, watching. But of course he wasn't. The night had swallowed him whole, just as it had done before, just as it would again. And somewhere, in another part of the city, in another darkened alley where someone else might be crying out for help, he was already moving toward the next fight. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to watch our other videos for more gripping content. Share this video with your friends and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.